The suitcase was already half packed before I fully understood what I was doing. I remember standing in my bedroom in Phoenix, holding a folded blouse I didn't even remember taking from the drawer, and thinking, something is wrong. Not the vague, general worry that comes with being a mother and never quite goes away. Something specific, something with edges. My daughter-in-law had answered my call that afternoon on the third ring, which was unusual. Normally she let it go to voicemail. When she finally picked up, her voice had that particular brightness that people use when they're performing calm. A little too even, a little too cheerful, with a half-second delay before each answer, like she was consulting a script. "How's Philip?" I asked. "Oh, he's good, just tired from work." You know how he gets. I did know how he got. Philip had been calling me less. The calls had been getting shorter since October, and it was now February. When I mentioned it to my husband, my late husband, I should say, because Gerald passed 3 years ago and I still sometimes slip into the present tense when I talk about him, he would have said I was reading too much into it. Gerald always said I was too sensitive. Maybe he was right about some things, but not about this. I booked the flight to Houston at 9:15 that evening. Direct. Early departure. I told myself I was just going to visit, surprise him. Mothers do that. I didn't tell Meredith I was coming. I should explain something about Meredith, because if I don't, none of the rest of this makes sense. When Philip brought her home for the first time, this was 4 years ago, Christmas, I tried. I genuinely tried. She was pretty in that self-conscious way, always aware of how she looked in a room, always angling herself slightly toward the best light. She laughed a little too hard at things that weren't quite funny and went quiet when the conversation didn't center on her. I noticed these things the way you notice a draft in an old house. Not alarming exactly, just something to keep an eye on. Philip was 34 and had been alone for a long time after a bad breakup in his late 20s. He wanted a family, he wanted a partner. I understood that wanting. I had felt it myself at his age, and Gerald had been the answer to it, so who was I to judge how that need manifested in my son? I kept my reservations to myself. I smiled at Christmas dinner. I sent her birthday cards. But I noticed things. She hadn't attended her own father's second wedding because she said they had a conflict, though Philip later let slip, in one of our longer phone calls, that they'd had no plans that weekend at all. She spoke about money in a way that made me uneasy. Not about having it or earning it, but about accessing it, about positioning, about what was hers by right of marriage. When they bought the house in the Heights neighborhood of Houston, she referred to it in front of Philip as my house, not our house, not the house, and Philip didn't flinch, which told me he'd stopped flinching a long time ago, and then the calls from him started getting shorter. The flight landed at 6:40 in the morning. I had one carry-on and Gerald's old watch on my wrist because I always wear it when I need to feel steady. I rented a car at the airport, something compact, forgettable, and I drove to their neighborhood without calling ahead. Their street was quiet, in the way that residential streets are quiet at 7 a.m. on a Thursday. A few cars pulling out of driveways, sprinklers running. I parked 2 houses down and sat for a moment, which sounds dramatic but wasn't. I just needed a minute. Meredith's car was not in the driveway. Philip's truck was. I rang the bell. Nothing. I knocked. Nothing. I had a key. Philip had given it to me when they moved in, one of those small gestures that meant more to me than he probably realized, and after 5 minutes of nothing, I used it. The house was dim and smelled stale. The kitchen had dishes in the sink from what looked like several days ago. There was a takeout container on the counter with the receipt still attached, dated 4 days prior. The recycling bin by the back door had 3 empty bottles of Pedialyte in it. Philip wasn't a Pedialyte person. I found him in the master bedroom. He was lying on top of the covers, fully dressed, in the same clothes he'd apparently been wearing for days. His face was grey, in a way that had nothing to do with the light. He was conscious. He opened his eyes when I said his name. But when he tried to sit up, he couldn't manage it. His breathing was shallow and fast and all wrong. "Mom," he said. Just that. Like the word cost him something. I called 911 before I was even fully in the room. The paramedics came in 4 minutes. I stood in the hallway and watched them work and kept my hands very still at my sides, because if I moved them, I wasn't sure what I would do with them. They stabilized him and got him onto a stretcher, and one of the paramedics, a young woman with her hair pulled back tight, told me he was severely dehydrated and that his oxygen levels were low, and that they were taking him to Memorial Hermann. I followed the ambulance in the rental car. In the waiting room, I called Meredith. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I texted, "Philip is in the hospital. Call me." I sat in a plastic chair and watched the doors and waited. A doctor came out after 40 minutes and told me that my son had a serious infection, bacterial pneumonia, that had been progressing, untreated, for at least a week, possibly longer. His fever had been extremely high. If he had waited another day, possibly two, the outcome might have been significantly different. He asked if there was a spouse. I said yes. He asked if she was on her way. I said I was trying to reach her. He nodded in the way that people nod when they understand, more than you've told them. I went outside and called Meredith a third time. This time she answered. The background noise told me everything before she said a single word. I could hear music, not the kind you play in a house, the kind you play in a venue, with bass and crowd noise layered underneath. I could hear a woman laughing near the phone. I could hear, very distinctly, the sound of wind that comes off open water. "Hey," she said, bright, performing again. "Philip is in the hospital," I said. "Memorial Hermann. He's been admitted. He has severe pneumonia. The doctor says he's been sick for over a week." A pause. Just long enough. "Oh, wow," she said. "Okay. Yeah, let me figure out how to get back. Where are you?" Another pause. "I'm in Galveston, with some friends." It was kind of a last-minute thing. Philip had been lying in that bedroom, too weak to dial a phone, for at least 4 days, and his wife was in Galveston. I said, "Come now," and I hung up. She arrived 7 hours later. 7 hours from Galveston to Houston, which is, under normal traffic, about an hour's drive. I didn't ask about the math. I sat with Philip, who was on IV antibiotics and oxygen, and held his hand, and watched him sleep, and tried not to count the hours. When Meredith came in, she smelled like sunscreen and something sweeter underneath it. She had a weekend bag over her shoulder. She was wearing a sundress. She looked at Philip in the hospital bed and her expression did something complicated. Not grief exactly, not even worry, more like inconvenience. And then she looked at me and something in her face recalibrated. "I came as fast as I could," she said. I didn't respond to that. I asked her quietly if she had known he was this sick before she left for Galveston. "He told me he had a cold," she said. "He had a fever of 104, I said. "For days. Did you take his temperature? Did you call a doctor?" "He said he was fine. He could not lift his own head off the pillow." She set her back down and sat in the chair on the other side of the bed and took out her phone. I watched her scroll through it for a few seconds, and then I looked away. Philip improved slowly over the following days. Antibiotics did their work. His color came back. He started being able to hold a full conversation, which he hadn't been able to do when I arrived. He had been too weak, too foggy, drifting in and out. When he was lucid and stable, he told me things he had probably been storing up for a while. He told me that the Galveston trip had been planned for 2 weeks, that he had told Meredith he wasn't feeling well the morning she left, and she had said she'd already paid the deposit, that at some point his fever had spiked, and he had tried to text her, and she had responded with a thumbs-up emoji. He said this last part without any particular emotion, which was somehow worse than if he had said it with bitterness. He also told me about the separate bank account she had opened 6 months after they married, about the credit cards in her name alone that the statements never came to the house for, about the conversation he'd overheard. By accident, he said. Though I'm not entirely sure he wanted to preserve that particular version of events, where she'd been on the phone with someone, talking about what the house would sell for if they ever split things up. Philip had been a civil engineer for 12 years. He was careful, precise, methodical. He didn't tell me any of this to alarm me. He told me because being sick for that long strips away the things you tell yourself to get through ordinary days, and he was finally too tired to carry it alone. I listened to all of it, and I held his hand. And when I went home to the house that evening, because Meredith had taken to staying only a few hours at the hospital before leaving again, I sat at Philip's kitchen table, and I made a list. I had been a hospital administrator for 31 years before I retired. People sometimes assume that means I spent 3 decades behind a desk, But that's not what hospital administration is. It means I understand systems. It means I understand how institutions work and how they can be made to work for you if you know where to apply pressure. It means I am not easily confused by paperwork or intimidated by bureaucracy. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name is not relevant, but I will say that I've known him for 22 years and he does not waste words. I told him what I had found and what Philip had told me and what I needed to know. He asked me several questions. He asked if Philip had a will. He asked if Philip had ever named me as a secondary on any financial accounts. He asked about beneficiary designations. I told him what I knew, and he told me what we could do within the law. Then I called Philip's HR department at his engineering firm. I had the number because I'd helped him navigate his benefits package when he first started there years ago, and I asked carefully about his health insurance status and about whether the emergency contact on file was current. They confirmed, after some navigation, that it listed Meredith as primary emergency contact. I asked whether there was a process to update that, and they walked me through it. Then I called Philip. He was feeling well enough to have that conversation. It took 2 hours. By the end of it, he had agreed to call his attorney, not mine, his own, whom he had used for the home purchase, and to begin a conversation he had been putting off for longer than I knew. What I did not know then, but would learn later, was that Philip had already had that conversation 3 months earlier. He had already updated his will. He had already spoken to his own attorney. He simply hadn't told me because he hadn't wanted to frighten me. And because he was Philip. And Philip processed things quietly, internally, in the same way his father had, and only let you see the conclusion. Meredith found out about the will change on a Tuesday. I don't know how, exactly. Philip said he hadn't told her, and I believe him. I think she found something, a document, an email confirmation, something she wasn't supposed to find, because that's who Meredith was, someone who looked for information the way some people look for exits in a room, habitually, automatically. She called me, not Philip. Me. The call lasted 11 minutes and I am not going to repeat most of what she said. I will say that she was not performing anymore. Whatever the calibrated, careful version of Meredith was, this was not it. This was the version underneath, and it was not quiet. She told me I had no right to interfere in their marriage. She told me that everything Philip had was hers by right. She told me that I was a bitter old woman who had never liked her. That last part had some truth in it, I'll admit, so I didn't argue. When she paused to breathe, I said, Meredith, Philip is your husband, and he is the only person who has any say in how he manages his finances and his estate. If you have concerns about that, you should speak to him directly. She said several more things. I waited. Then I said, he was lying in that bedroom for 5 days. You were in Galveston. She hung up. Philip came home from the hospital after 8 days. He and Meredith were in the same house for another 6 weeks while their respective attorneys worked through the process. He told me, on one of our now daily phone calls, that they barely spoke, that she had moved into the guest room, that she left for long stretches and came back at odd hours, and he had stopped asking where she'd been. The divorce was finalized on a timeline that surprised even my attorney. I think Meredith had anticipated a different outcome than the one she received, and once she understood what the numbers actually were, what Philip had in his name, what was jointly held, what the prenuptial agreement they had signed actually said, which her own attorney apparently had not carefully explained to her at the time, the calculation changed. What had seemed worth fighting for was less straightforward than she had assumed. She left Texas 4 months after the divorce was final. I don't know where she went. I find that I don't need to know. Philip sold the house in the Heights. He said he didn't want it anymore, that it had too many different kinds of weight in its walls. I understood that. He bought a smaller place in a quieter neighborhood closer to his office, and he put a vegetable garden in the backyard, which is something he had wanted to do since he was 12 years old and used to follow Gerald around our Phoenix yard on Saturday mornings asking questions about soil and drainage. He called me every Sunday now. Sometimes we talked for 20 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. We talked about Gerald more than we used to. We talked about the garden. We talked about what he wanted the next years to look like. He had a friend from his firm, a quieter kind of friendship, the kind that builds slowly over shared lunches and a standing joke. And then one day you realize the person is important to you. Her name was Cecily. I met her at Thanksgiving, which Philip hosted for the first time in the new house, with the garden gone dormant for winter and the string lights he'd put up on the back porch, illuminating the frost on the raised beds. Cicely brought a casserole she'd clearly spent real effort on, and she helped clear the table without being asked. And she laughed at Philip's stories in a way that was specific to his stories rather than general purpose. I watched her across the table and I thought, this one pays attention. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Some conclusions you let your children arrive at on their own. Before Philip left my car the evening I drove him to his new house for the first time, just to see it. Before he officially moved in, he wanted to walk through it with someone he trusted. He sat for a moment with his hand on the door handle, the way he does when there's something he wants to say and is organizing how to say it. I kept thinking about it, he said, in the hospital, when the fever was bad and I couldn't think straight. I kept thinking, nobody knows I'm here. He paused. And then you were there. He got out of the car and walked up the path to his new front door, and I watched him work the key in the lock and push it open and step inside. And I sat in the car in the early dark and felt the full weight of all of it, the terror of those first hours, the hospital smell, the sound of Meredith's voice in Galveston, the 11-minute phone call, Philip's hand in mine while he slept. And I let myself feel it completely, all at once, because that's the only way to carry something like that. You feel it fully, and then you set it down. Not forever. You don't set things like that down forever, but enough. Gerald's watch ticked on my wrist. Outside, Philip turned on a light. There is a scholarship now. It's small, we're building it. But it's real. Philip set it up through his firm's foundation for engineering students from underserved school districts in the Houston area. He named it for Gerald, not for himself, not for me, for his father, who taught him that precision mattered and that systems could be understood if you were patient enough to learn them. The first recipient started her freshman year at UT Austin last fall. Philip met her at the signing ceremony, and she shook his hand with both of hers and said, very seriously, that she was going to make it count. He called me on the drive home, still a little undone by it. She meant it, he said. You could tell she meant every word. Of course she did, I said. She's an engineer. He laughed. It's a good laugh, Philip's, full and unhurried, like he's not watching the clock, like he has time. He does, I remind myself. He has time. And I was there when it mattered most, which is the only promise I ever made him, the day he was born, before he could understand language or promises, or the particular terror of loving someone, that completely I was there. I am here. That part doesn't change. People ask me sometimes, not directly, but in the way people circle around things they're curious about, whether I regret how any of it unfolded, whether I think I pushed too hard, or moved too fast, or crossed some line that a mother-in-law isn't supposed to cross. I think about that question honestly. I don't dismiss it. Here's what I keep coming back to. I didn't cause any of what happened. I didn't create the separate bank account Meredith had opened 6 months into the marriage, or the credit cards with statements that never came to the house, or the conversation Philip had overheard about what the house might sell for. I didn't make her leave for Galveston while her husband's fever climbed past 104. I didn't make her answer my call that morning with music in the background and water wind, and that calibrated, performing brightness in her voice. Those were choices. Hers. Every single one of them. What I've learned, really learned, not the version of it you repeat to sound wise, but the version that costs something to know, is that character isn't what people tell you about themselves. It's not the words they use in good lighting. It's what they do when the situation is inconvenient and no one they want to impress is watching. Meredith was watching herself constantly. She monitored every impression she made, every angle of every room. And yet when Philip needed her most, when there was nothing to perform for and no audience to manage, she chose Galveston. That's not a mystery. That's a revelation. Situations like that one don't create who a person is. They just remove the cover. I think about Philip in that bedroom, dressed, lying on top of the covers, too weak to sit up. And I think about the discipline it took for him to build a life after that. Not just the divorce, which was painful in the practical ways, divorces are painful, but the harder work of understanding what he had allowed himself not to see for years. That kind of honesty requires something, It requires looking at your own choices without flinching, which is something most people spend enormous energy avoiding. Philip did the hard thing. He looked, and then he rebuilt, quietly, methodically, in the same way he approaches every engineering problem, which is to understand the structure first and then fix what's actually broken, not just what's visible. I think that's what I'm most proud of. Not that I got on a plane, not that I knew to call my attorney, or that the legal outcomes went the way they did. Those things mattered, but they're not the part that stays with me. What stays with me is watching my son become someone who could sit across a Thanksgiving table from a woman who paid attention to him, really paid attention, the specific kind, not the general purpose kind, and know the difference. Know it in his body, not just his head. The scholarship carries Gerald's name. That was Philip's idea entirely. He didn't consult me, didn't ask my opinion. He just called one afternoon and told me what he was doing, and I had to set the phone down for a moment because I couldn't speak. Gerald was a precise man who believed that systems could be understood if you were patient enough. He believed that most problems, if you traced them back far enough, came down to either a structural flaw or a failure of attention. He was usually right. He would have looked at everything that happened with Meredith and with that house in the Heights, and he would have traced it back to attention, to the failure of it, and then to the recovery of it. The first scholarship recipient shook Philip's hand with both of hers and told him she was going to make it count. He called me on the drive home, still undone by it. She will make it count. I believe that completely. Not because the world rewards intention. It doesn't, not reliably, but because she has already demonstrated by being in that room that she understands what it costs to build something. That's the beginning of everything worth doing. I was there when Philip needed me. I will be there as long as I can be. And he's building something now. That's enough. That's everything.